the stone came loose wrong. That was the first thing the masons noticed. Sometime in the late summer of 1908, when Cornelius Vanderbilt III's maintenance crew was conducting routine reinforcement work on the lower foundations of the breakers. The 70-room Newport, Rhode Island palazzo that his grandfather Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built in 1895 to announce, in the most unmistakable architectural terms imaginable, that one American family now occupied a tier of wealth that had no precedent in the Republic's history. The crew was experienced. These were men who knew what stone felt like when it had been sitting undisturbed for years, how the mortar behaved, how the subgrade fill responded to the coastal humidity that rolled in off Narragansett Bay. What they encountered has been described differently by different people across more than a century of transmission. What the accounts agree on is this: there was a chamber, a sealed space beneath the foundation level that did not correspond to any blueprint the estate's caretaker staff could produce. It had not been catalogued in the construction records that Richard Morris Hunt's architectural office had maintained during the original build. It was not on the utility schematics. It had no apparent function. And it contained something. What exactly it contained is the question that has never been fully answered on the public record. Because within days of the discovery, the order came down from the family to seal it back. The workers were told not to discuss what they had seen. The records of the work order that initiated the excavation quietly vanished from the estate's maintenance logs. The foreman who supervised the crew was transferred within the month to a separate Vanderbilt property on the Hudson. If what they found was nothing, why did a family with the resources and the reach of the Vanderbilts go to such deliberate lengths to make sure no one would be able to ask about it? And if it was something, what in the history of that site, or in the history that predates the estate's construction entirely, could explain what was sealed back beneath the most famous summer cottage in America? What follows is an attempt to answer that question using every source that survived the suppression. The oral accounts, the cartographic record, the physical logic of the site, and the pattern of institutional behavior that, once you know how to read it, tells its own story. By 1908, the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune, originally assembled by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, through the consolidation of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, had produced a family wealth that in today's adjusted terms exceeded $100 billion. The family did not merely own things. They structured the economic geography of the American Northeast. The New York Central lines determined which towns grew and which ones slowly died. The construction of the breakers in 1895, following the destruction of an earlier structure by fire, was a signal to every other wealthy family in America about what serious money looked like when it decided to spend. The house was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect of the American Gilded Age, who died in the same year the house was completed, making the breakers a kind of final monument to both the man and the era. In 1908, the property was firmly under the control of the living Vanderbilt family, which meant that any decision about what was discovered on the grounds was made by people who understood that their social position required active maintenance, that reputation was infrastructure. The Vanderbilts, in 1908, possessed something that very few private individuals in American history have possessed to the same degree: the practical ability to make something stop existing in the written record without that erasure ever being recorded either. The Ocker Point promontory, on which the breakers sits, was not an empty piece of Rhode Island coastline before European settlement. The land belonged to the Narragansett people, one of the most significant indigenous nations of the northeastern seaboard. There is a body of research suggesting the coastal high points of Aquidneck Island were used for purposes that went beyond habitation or fishing. Access. Sites of structured, deliberate, and permanent construction intended to last. The core claim is this: the chamber the Vanderbilt workers found in 1908 was not a colonial construction. It was older, significantly older, and its contents were consistent with what you would expect to find in a deliberately sealed Narragansett repository. The foundational reinforcement work that brought the crew to the lower courses of the northeast corner of the main structure began in late July or early August, according to the oral account preserved by a Newport Mason's family across 3 generations. The foreman, Thomas Carew, was directing the work when one of his crew noticed that the soil behind a section of interior subgrade fill had a different texture and color than the surrounding material. The workman used the butt of his hammer to probe the area, and the sound it returned was wrong. Not the dull, soil-absorbed thud he expected. Something hollow, something architectural. What they uncovered was a space roughly the shape and dimensions of a root cellar. Approximately 8 feet in depth, 12 feet in length, and 6 feet in width, but lined in a manner that no one on the crew had seen in any cellar or crawl space they had ever worked on. The walls were not brick. They were fitted stone, laid without mortar in the dry stone technique, and the fitting was described, in language that has passed through the oral record with unusual consistency, as extraordinarily precise, tighter than anything the Masons had seen in their professional work. And there were objects inside. The accounts converge on certain broad characteristics. Wrapped bundles, large and numerous, placed in an ordered arrangement. Wooden structures, partially collapsed. And a carved stone element, upright, positioned near the center of the space. Carew sent a man to the estate office immediately. The response from the estate's management was rapid. Within 2 hours, a representative of the family arrived at the site. The workers were told to stop, to leave the area, and to speak to no one. By the following morning, a different crew, whose members have never been identified in any surviving account, was brought in to reseal the chamber. Within a week, the original maintenance crew had been reassigned or dismissed. The mainstream position is that what the workers found was almost certainly a colonial-era storage feature of some kind, a pre-existing root cellar or cold storage chamber associated with an earlier structure on the Ochre Point site. The first problem is the construction quality. Every account emphasizes the precision of the fitted stone work. Dry stone construction of that caliber is not a feature of colonial-era root cellars in Rhode Island. The people who described the walls were professional masons. They said this was different. The second problem is the depth. The chamber was below the existing 1895 foundation courses, meaning that if it had been associated with the earlier structure, it would have been visible during the excavation for the breaker's own foundation in 1893 and 1894. The third problem is the institutional response. If what Carew's crew found was a collapsed colonial root cellar, there would have been no reason, none, for the family to treat it the way they did. The response is not proportionate to a mundane discovery. Across the coastal promontories of Narragansett Bay, there is a pattern of accounts stretching from the early colonial period into the 20th century, describing the discovery of subterranean constructed spaces that do not match any known European building tradition. One of the earliest documented instances comes from a 1680 land survey that describes, in passing, the existence of what the surveyor calls a stone cellar of unknowing origin on a coastal hill. The surveyor notes it, marks it on his working map, and then it appears on none of the subsequent official cartographic records. In the 1840s, a farmer clearing land on Conanicut Island reported to a Providence newspaper the discovery of a stone-lined underground chamber containing large baskets and posts of dark hard wood. A follow-up item described him as having mistaken a natural depression for something more remarkable. The volume of these structurally similar accounts, distributed across the same geographic region across 2.5 centuries, is not something that can be waved away as coincidence. When a type of discovery keeps occurring in the same area and keeps generating the same suppression response, the suppression itself becomes part of the pattern. The most immediate and surface-level motive is reputational. The Vanderbilts had built the breakers as a monument to civilization, to European refinement transplanted to the American coast, to centuries of cultivated taste expressed in marble and bronze. The idea that beneath this monument to civilizational achievement there sat a pre-contact indigenous chamber, intact and deliberately sealed by people who had been on this land for thousands of years, carries an implicit counter-narrative the family would have found, at minimum, embarrassing. A chamber beneath the breakers that had been there for centuries before they arrived made the house a surface feature laid atop someone else's deeper history. It made the Vanderbilts, for all their power, the most recent layer. If we are serious about the epistemological status of this account, we have to reckon with what it actually is. An oral history transmitted across multiple generations, beginning with an individual who was told to stay silent, preserved in a single family's private memory. The very things that make us cautious about the oral account. The lack of written records, the absence of contemporaneous reporting, the silence in the institutional archives, are themselves steps in the specific context of this story, evidence of something. The story exists because one man talked anyway. He told someone, they told someone, that someone eventually told someone who thought it mattered enough to preserve. That chain of transmission is fragile and imperfect, and it is, in the absence of anything else, what we have. We do not know with certainty what was in that chamber. We know with a fair degree of confidence that the chamber existed. The convergence of oral, account, physical logic, comparative pattern, and the specific character of the institutional response builds a cumulative case that is difficult to dismiss. We know that the land beneath the breakers has a history the official narrative of the estate has never engaged with. A Narragansett history, a pre-contact history, a history that does not begin with Richard Morris Hunt's drawings or the Vanderbilt family's purchase of the lot. The Preservation Society of Newport County maintains the breakers. They welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. The guided tour does not stop at the lower foundation level. There is no exhibit about the pre-contact history of the Oar Point site. There has been no ground-penetrating radar survey conducted on the sections of the property that correspond to the area 6 described in the oral account. That could be because there is nothing there to find. Or it could be because no one with the authority to commission the survey has decided that finding it is worth what finding it might reveal. Somewhere in the lower strata of Ochre Point, beneath the Italian Renaissance grandeur, beneath the perfectly maintained gardens that slope toward the Atlantic, something either is or isn't waiting. Objects wrapped by hands that worked this promontory, long before any Vanderbilt was born, or just the compacted fill of a century of undisturbed earth. What do you think they found? You can take away the written record. You can transfer the foreman. You can send a different crew to pour new mortar over the old stones. But the story has its own way of surviving. It finds a gap and it comes through. It always does. And somewhere on Ochre Point, as the Atlantic wind comes off the water the way it always has, the stones that those workers exposed for a few hours on a summer morning more than a century ago are sitting in exactly the position they were left in, patient, unmoved, keeping whatever it is they were built to keep.